Imagine waking up one morning and finding your entire neighborhood gone. Not burned, not destroyed, not flooded or buried under ash, just gone. The house is still standing, the doors still on their hinges, the food still on the tables, cold but untouched. And every single person you have ever known, your neighbors, your friends, your children, vanished without a single trace, without a single body, without a single drop of blood. The only thing left behind is one word. One word carved into the bark of a tree, rough and deliberate and somehow more terrifying than any scream could ever be. One word that has haunted the American imagination for over 400 years. Croatoa. That is the story we are telling today. And I promise you, by the time we are done, you will understand why this is not just a mystery. This is the ghost that America was born with. Let us go back, way back. Back to a time before the United States existed, before the American flag, before the Constitution, before any of it. Back to the late 16th century, when the world was being cracked open like an egg by European powers desperate to claim whatever they could find on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. England, in particular, was hungry. Spain had already planted itself deep in the Americas, building cities and siphoning treasure back across the ocean. France had its eyes on the north. And England, proud, ambitious, increasingly Protestant England under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, England was watching all of this and growing restless. It needed a foothold, it needed a colony, it needed to prove that it could do what Spain had done, what France was attempting, what every naval power on the continent was scrambling to accomplish. And so it sent ships west. And what happened next would become one of the most enduring, most chilling, most debated mysteries in the history of the entire Western world. The man behind the first expeditions was a soldier, explorer and poet named Sir Walter Raleigh. He was charming and ambitious and brilliant, and exactly the kind of man who could walk into the court of Elizabeth I and convince her to fund a dangerous transatlantic venture on the strength of his confidence alone. Raleigh had been granted a royal charter in 1584, which gave him the right to settle any land not already claimed by a Christian monarch. This was a very convenient legal fiction, of course, a way of ignoring that millions of indigenous people already lived on these lands, had lived on these lands for thousands of years, had built complex societies and languages and trade networks and spiritual traditions that predated England by an eternity. But that was the logic of the age, and Raleigh operated within it without hesitation. He sent his first expedition to scout the coast, to find a suitable location, to bring back information and, if possible, bring back a couple of indigenous people to parade before the Queen as proof that the New World was real and ripe for the taking. That first expedition returned with good news and two men named Manteo and Wanchese, who had been brought across the ocean as curiosities and translators, stripped of their homes and carried to a foreign land to serve as living evidence of English ambition. They were members of the Algonquian-speaking peoples who lived along the coast of what is now North Carolina. They were, despite everything, treated with a degree of respect in England. They were dressed well, they were presented at court, they were studied by scholars who were fascinated by their language and customs. But they were also pawns, instruments in a much larger game, and when they eventually returned home, they returned with very different feelings about the English and what the English wanted. The first real colonization attempt came in 1585. Raleigh organized a fleet of 7 ships carrying over 500 men, soldiers, craftsmen, scientists, surveyors, and sent them across the Atlantic to establish a settlement on Roanoke Island, a narrow strip of land tucked behind the barrier islands of what is now the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The location was not ideal. The waters were treacherous and shallow, making it difficult for large ships to approach. The island itself was small and offered limited agricultural potential. But it was remote enough to be defensible, or so the English thought, and it was near indigenous communities who could, in theory, provide food and assistance while the settlers got established. In theory. The reality was far messier. The English colonists struggled almost immediately. They had not brought enough food to sustain themselves through the first winter. They were soldiers and gentlemen, not farmers, and they had badly underestimated what it would take to survive in a land where nothing worked the way they expected it to. They turned to the local Algonquian peoples for help, specifically the Croatoan and Roanoke tribes, and at first there was a kind of uneasy cooperation, a tentative exchange of food and information and cautious goodwill. But the English were suspicious and heavy-handed. When some of their silver was stolen or they believed it was stolen, they responded with disproportionate violence, burning an entire indigenous village and destroying the crops inside it. Just like that, the fragile goodwill shattered. The local people who had been willing to trade and cooperate now had every reason to view the English as dangerous, unpredictable enemies. The first colony limped along through 1585 and into 1586, growing increasingly desperate for supplies and reinforcements from England. And then in the summer of 1586, salvation arrived in the form of Sir Francis Drake, who had been raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and stopped by Roanoke on his way home. The colonists took one look at the ships and made a collective decision: they were done. They loaded onto Drake's ships and sailed back to England, leaving Roanoke Island empty behind them. Except not quite empty. A small group of 15 soldiers had been left behind to maintain an English presence on the island, to hold the fort, to be there when the next expedition arrived. When the next expedition did arrive, just weeks later, those 15 men were gone. No explanation, just an empty fort and a single skeleton found on the beach. The first disappearance. A prelude to something much, much larger. Raleigh was not deterred. If anything, he was more determined than ever to establish a permanent English presence in the Americas. But he made some changes to his approach. Instead of sending soldiers and gentlemen, he would send families. Whole families, men and women and children, who would have real stakes in making the colony work, who would build homes rather than forts, who would farm rather than raid, who would, in theory, create the kind of sustainable community that soldiers alone never could. He appointed a man named John White as governor of this new colony. White was an artist, a watercolorist, a man of unusual sensitivity and perception who had been part of the earlier expeditions, and had spent time carefully documenting the indigenous people and landscapes he encountered. His paintings of the Algonquian people are among the most extraordinary artifacts of the 16th century, detailed, respectful, alive with color and specificity. White was not a soldier. He was an observer, a recorder, and he believed, perhaps naively, that the colony could succeed if it was built on a different foundation than the first one had been. In the summer of 1587, White led a fleet of 3 ships carrying 117 colonists to Roanoke Island. Among them were men and women and children of various ages, including White's own daughter, Elena Dare, who was heavily pregnant. The plan had been to stop at Roanoke only briefly, to pick up the 15 soldiers left behind by the previous expedition, and then continue further north to establish the main colony in the Chesapeake Bay area, where the land was more fertile and the waters more navigable. But things went wrong almost immediately. The fleet's pilot, a man named Simon Fernandez, refused to take the colonists any further north. He had his own agenda. He wanted to spend the summer raiding Spanish ships in the Caribbean, and he had already wasted too much time on this colonial venture. He dropped the colonists at Roanoke and sailed away. Just like that, the plan changed. Roanoke would be the colony whether anyone wanted it or not. The colonists arrived to find the fort the soldiers had built in ruins. The houses were overgrown with weeds and vines, and of the 15 men left behind, there was no sign except for a single pile of bones. Whatever had happened to those men, whether they had been killed by the local tribes who had been so brutalized by the first expedition, or whether they had tried to leave and been lost at sea, or whether something else entirely had befallen them, the colonists would never know. They set about repairing the fort and the houses, trying to make the place livable, trying to establish some kind of relationship with the local Algonquian peoples. Manteo, who had returned to Roanoke with this expedition after his time in England, helped broker a tentative peace with some of the nearby tribes. But the damage from the first colony was deep and lasting, and suspicion and hostility simmered just beneath the surface of every interaction. And then on the 18th of August, 1587, something remarkable happened in the middle of all this difficulty and uncertainty. Elena Dare gave birth to a baby girl, the first English child born in the Americas. They named her Virginia Dare, Virginia for the land, Dare for the family, and she was christened with ceremony and hope, a small act of faith in the future in the middle of a situation that was growing increasingly precarious. Virginia Dare, a name that would become legend. A name that would echo across centuries. A name belonging to a child who, like everyone else in that colony, would simply cease to exist. By the late summer of 1587, the colonists were in trouble. They were running out of food. Relations with the neighboring tribes were tense and unpredictable. They needed supplies and they needed them urgently. The question was who would go back to England to fetch them. The colonists debated. Some wanted to send a delegation. Others argued that the men they could spare were too few to sail the ocean safely. Eventually, after much deliberation, they turned to John White. He was the governor. He had connections in England. He knew Raleigh personally. He was the most likely person to be believed and to secure the resources they needed. And so, reluctantly, his heart heavy with something he could not quite name, John White agreed to go. He said goodbye to his daughter. He held his granddaughter Virginia, 10 days old, smelling of milk and new life. He climbed onto a ship. And he sailed away, watching the island grow small and then disappear over the horizon, never imagining, or perhaps refusing to imagine, that he would never see any of them again. What happened next is one of history's great ironies, one of its great cruelties. White arrived back in England in November 1587, fully intending to gather supplies and return immediately. But England had other problems. Spain was building an armada, a massive fleet, with the explicit intention of invading England, of crushing Protestant England once and for all, of placing a Catholic monarch on the English throne. Every ship, every sailor, every pound of supplies was being commandeered for the defense of the realm. Queen Elizabeth herself issued an order that no vessels could leave English ports for any reason. White was trapped. He watched the months turn, winter becoming spring, spring becoming summer, and he could do nothing. He petitioned. He wrote letters. He begged. And the war machine ground on without caring about 117 people on a small island across the ocean. The Spanish Armada came in the summer of 1588, and England defeated it, famously dramatically with the help of English seamanship and violent storms that scattered the great Spanish fleet. It was one of the defining moments of the Elizabethan age. But for John White it meant more months of delay. He finally managed to secure passage on a privateering expedition in 1588, but storms turned the ships back before they reached Roanoke. He tried again in 1590. 3 long years, 3 years of silence from the colony. 3 years with no word from his daughter, from his granddaughter, from the 117 people he had left behind. When he finally set sail again in the spring of 1590, he must have felt something complicated and difficult to name: hope, certainly, but also dread. The kind of dread that settles into your bones when you have been too long without news and you know, somewhere beneath the hope, that news delayed is rarely news that comforts. The ships arrived off the Outer Banks of North Carolina on the 2nd of August 1590. It was a difficult approach. The waters were shallow and treacherous, and getting the small boats to shore through the surf was dangerous work. White and a group of sailors made the attempt. As they approached Roanoke Island, they saw smoke rising from the north end of the island. Someone was there, someone had lit a fire. White's heart must have lifted. He shouted, he called out. They played trumpets and sang English songs into the darkness, trying to signal their presence, trying to draw out the colonists they believed were waiting just beyond the trees. But no one came. The smoke, it turned out, was from a grass-fired, dry summer grass that had caught and smoldered without anyone tending it. The next morning, White and the sailors landed on the island. They found the settlement. And what they found, or rather what they did not find, would become one of the most discussed, most analyzed, most mythologized moments in all of American history. The houses were gone, not burned, not destroyed, gone, dismantled, the wood taken. The fort itself had been pulled down, its timbers removed. The entire settlement had been methodically, deliberately deconstructed. This was not chaos. This was not massacre. This was intentional. Someone had taken this place apart piece by piece and carried it somewhere. The supplies White had buried before his departure, tools, equipment, books, armor, had been dug up. Some had been scattered and damaged by weather, but most were simply gone. And then on one of the trees at the entrance to the former settlement, carved into the bark in neat, careful letters 3 feet off the ground, CRA, that was all. No cross carved above it, which White had arranged with the colonists as a distress signal if they had left under duress. No symbol of danger, just the word, CROATOA, and on another tree just the first 3 letters, CRO. As if whoever had carved it had started there, gotten interrupted, and gone to finish the message somewhere else. White knew the word. Croatoan was the name of an island about 50 miles to the south, an island now known as Hatteras Island. It was also the name of the people who lived there, the Croatoan tribe with whom the colonists had had mostly friendly relations. Manteo, the man who had traveled to England and back, was himself a Croatoan. White believed, or allowed himself to believe, that the word was a message. That the colonists had left intentionally, had packed up their lives, had dismantled their settlement, perhaps to use the wood, and had gone to live among the Croatoan people on their island. It was the most hopeful interpretation. It was the interpretation he clung to. He pushed to investigate. He wanted to sail south to Croatoan Island immediately, but the weather was turning ugly. A storm was building. The captain of the flagship, spooked by the deteriorating conditions, refused to wait. Anchors were dragging. The situation was becoming dangerous. White was overruled. They would come back in the spring, the captain promised. They would return and investigate Croatoan Island properly. White had no choice but to agree. He climbed back onto the ship, watching the island recede again behind him just as it had 3 years before. This time he would never return. Storms drove the fleet off course and eventually back to England. Further expeditions were planned and cancelled. Raleigh's attention shifted. The colony was forgotten by everyone except the man whose daughter had given birth there, whose granddaughter had taken her first breath there, who had carried the weight of their absence across every day of the years that followed. John White died around 1593, never knowing what had happened to the 117 people he had left behind. He died with the word Croatoan unresolved in his mind, a splinter he could not remove, an answer that was also a question. And 400 years later we are still asking the same question. We are still standing in front of that tree, staring at those letters, trying to understand what they mean. The theories began almost immediately and they have never stopped. The simplest and in many ways most compelling explanation is also the one that was suggested by the word itself. The colonists went to live with the Croatoan people. This theory proposes that faced with dwindling food supplies, hostile neighboring tribes, and the long absence of Governor White, the colonists made a rational decision. They had friends among the Croatoan. They had Manteo who could translate, who could vouch for them, who had personal connections on that island. They dismantled their settlement, taking the wood because wood was valuable and they would need it wherever they were going, and they walked away from Roanoke Island and integrated themselves to whatever degree into Croatoan society. Some may have intermarried. Some may have adopted indigenous ways of living. Some may have kept their English identity carefully preserved for years, waiting for ships that never came, and eventually died as old men and women in a world utterly unlike the one they had been born into. There is actually some evidence for this. Several decades after the disappearance, when English settlers were beginning to establish themselves more permanently in the Chesapeake region, the settlement at Jamestown, founded in 1607, was just a few hundred miles north. There were reports from indigenous informants of people who lived inland, people who could speak English, people who wore European-style clothing, people who had developed certain European tools and technologies. Captain John Smith, of Jamestown fame, heard these reports and took them seriously enough to plan expeditions to investigate. None of those expeditions ever reached their destination. The people who were said to have European connections were never found and interviewed by anyone who left a written record. The reports remained tantalizing and unverifiable, like almost everything connected to Roanoke. In the early 20th century, a man named Hamilton Macmillan proposed a more elaborate version of this integration theory. He pointed to the Lumbee people of North Carolina, a large indigenous group living inland from the coast, and argued that they were descendants of the Roanoke colonists who had integrated with the Croatoan tribe and then moved inland over generations. His evidence included the fact that many Lumbee family names in the 19th century were the same as names recorded on the Roanoke Colony roster: Dare, White, Cooper, Brooks, Sampson, and the fact that the Lumbee spoke English rather than an Algonquian language, which Macmillan found significant. Subsequent scholars have been mostly skeptical of this theory, noting that surname similarities could have other explanations, and that the Lumbee's English-speaking status likely has more to do with missionary activity in the 18th century than with 17th-century colonial integration. But the Lumbee community itself has embraced this connection to varying degrees over the years, and the question remains genuinely open. Other theories are darker. Some historians believe the colonists were not absorbed but destroyed, killed by indigenous tribes who had been pushed beyond patience by English aggression. The Powhatan people who lived in the Chesapeake region were one of the most powerful confederacies on the eastern seaboard, and there are accounts from the Jamestown period suggesting that Powhatan himself admitted to having killed a group of Europeans who had been living south of his territory around the time the first Jamestown settlers arrived. If this was the Roanoke Colony, and it may have been if the colonists had moved north toward the Chesapeake as originally planned, then their end was violent, a consequence of the tensions and fears and strategic calculations of a political world that the English had disrupted without fully understanding. This theory is supported by some archaeological and historical evidence, and many serious scholars consider it the most likely explanation for at least some of the colonists' fate. There is also the theory of dispersal, that the colonists did not all end up in the same place, that different families went in different directions, joining different indigenous communities, and that the single word Croatoan represented only one faction's destination, not the entire colony's choice. Under this theory, the colonists scattered, some going south to Croatoan Island, some going north toward the Chesapeake, some perhaps going inland into the vast interior of the continent. Some may have survived for decades, some may have died quickly. The diversity of outcomes under this theory explains the diversity of the fragmentary evidence, the reports of English speakers here, the family names there, the European artifacts found in unexpected places. There was no single fate. There were 117 fates diverging into the forest like paths that branch and branch again until they are too small and too numerous to follow. And then there are the stranger theories. There have always been stranger theories. Some have suggested supernatural explanations, curses, portals, divine punishment for the hubris of empire. These theories say more about human psychology than about Roanoke, but they persist because mystery is a kind of hunger and the supernatural offers a particularly satisfying meal. Others have speculated about secret underground shelters, about colonies within colonies, about elaborate hoaxes and deceptions. In the 1930s, a series of stones were discovered across North Carolina and Georgia, covered in inscriptions purportedly written by Eleanor Dare, chronicling the colony's fate, a story of disease and conflict and survival and eventual massacre. The stones were sensational. They were also almost certainly forgeries. the work of someone who understood exactly what people wanted to believe and gave it to them in the most dramatic form possible. The Dare Stones, as they came to be called, were discredited by academic analysis, but they lingered in the popular imagination because people needed the story to have an ending, even a fabricated one. The truth is that archaeology has been our most productive tool in recent decades, and even archaeology has produced more questions than answers. Excavations on Roanoke Island itself have uncovered evidence of European presence, a signet ring, some copper items, earthenware that appears to be of English origin, but nothing that definitively tells us what happened to the colonists or where they went. More recently, archaeological work on Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan island, has uncovered European artifacts mixed in with indigenous ones in ways that suggest contact and possibly cohabitation. A fireplace incorporating European bricks, metal working tools of European manufacture, copper objects that appear to have been reworked by indigenous craftspeople. These finds are suggestive. They whisper of a story in which English colonists and Croatoan people shared space and resources and possibly lives. But they do not speak clearly. They do not give us names or faces or the particular texture of what it felt like to be an English person living in a Croatoan village, wondering if the ships would ever come, wondering what home meant when home was 6 weeks across an ocean that seemed to grow wider every year. What the Roanoke mystery asks us, ultimately, is a question about what happens when worlds collide. The English colonists were not innocent bystanders in a neutral landscape. They arrived in a place that was already full of people, full of history, full of relationships and conflicts and political arrangements that went back for thousands of years. They arrived with assumptions about ownership and civilization, and the right to take what they needed, and those assumptions brought them into conflict almost immediately. The indigenous peoples of the Outer Banks were not simple or primitive or passive. They were navigating a rapidly changing situation. European diseases had already been spreading through their communities before the English arrived, devastating populations, disrupting social structures, creating power vacuums that made everything more volatile. The arrival of the English was one more destabilizing force in a world that was already in upheaval. What looks from the English perspective like a mysterious disappearance may look very different from an indigenous perspective, as a story of adaptation, of negotiation, of the choices made by a community trying to absorb a group of desperate strangers without being destroyed by them. The word Croatoan does not have to be a mystery. It can be read as a direction, a decision, a deliberate act of communication left by people who were not vanishing but moving. People who were making a choice in difficult circumstances, choosing relationship over isolation, choosing survival over pride. The colony did not disappear, it transformed, it merged with something larger than itself. The English identity of the Roanoke colonists, so carefully maintained and so dearly valued, may have dissolved slowly into the Croatoan world, not violently, not tragically, but gradually, the way one body of water merges with another when the barrier between them is removed. Children grew up speaking both languages and then only one. Customs blended, memories faded. The granddaughter of John White, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, may have grown up as a Croatoan, may have married a Croatoan man, may have had children who thought of themselves as Croatoan without qualification. Her English name may have been forgotten within a generation, replaced by something that fit the world she actually lived in rather than the world she had been born into. Or she died young, or she was killed, or she sickened from a disease that crossed the boundary between the two communities in either direction, or she grew old and died with the memory of English ships fatting in her mind like a dream half remembered. We do not know, we will probably never know with certainty. And that uncertainty is the thing that makes Roanoke so powerful, so persistent, so resistant to being filed away and forgot. It is a story without an ending, and stories without endings have a way of staying alive forever, circling back on themselves, generating new theories and new investigations and new imaginative reconstructions with every generation that encounters them. What we know for certain is this. In 1587, 117 people arrived on a small island on the coast of North Carolina. Among them was a baby girl named Virginia Dare, born on the 18th of August, the first English child to take her first breath in the Americas. Their governor sailed away to get help and was kept from returning for 3 years by the machinery of war and the indifference of fate. When he came back, they were gone. The settlement was dismantled. The word Croatoan was carved into a tree, and then there was silence. 400 years of silence, broken only by theories and stories and the persistent human need to make meaning out of mystery. There are those who say the Roanoke Colony is America's original ghost story, and there is something to that. America was built on disappearances, on the erasure of people and histories and languages, on the transformation of what was there into something new and unrecognizable. The indigenous peoples of the Americas experienced that disappearance on a scale so vast and so prolonged that it becomes almost incomprehensible. The Roanoke colonists, European though they were, experienced a smaller version of the same dissolution. Their particular story was swallowed by the continent, absorbed into a world that was larger and older and more complex than they had imagined when they set sail from England, full of ambition and hope. There is a kind of justice to that, or at least a kind of symmetry. The people who came to claim a land they did not own were themselves claimed by that land, in ways they could not have predicted. The continent had its own logic, its own terms, its own way of absorbing and transforming whatever arrived on its shores. We are still waiting, and the silence, deep and wide as the Atlantic that kept John White from his daughter, offers nothing back but the echo of our own voices, asking and asking into the dark.